Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UNS Horizon watching the stars through the main viewport when his communications officer, Lieutenant Karen Bell, called out that they were receiving an unknown transmission from deep space, and Jake moved quickly to her station while asking what kind of signal they were picking up, and Karen explained that it appeared to be some kind of structured communication, possibly from an intelligent source, which made Jake order his crew to record everything and prepare for analysis. The signal came through with strange musical tones and complex patterns that seemed too organized to be natural phenomena, and Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who served as the ship's language specialist, began working immediately to decode the mysterious transmission while Jake contacted Earth to report their discovery, and within hours, Admiral Lisa Carter herself was speaking with Jake through quantum communication, demanding every detail about what they had found. Elena worked for 3 days straight, analyzing the signal patterns, and finally announced that she believed the transmission was definitely from an intelligent alien species trying to communicate with them, and the message seemed to contain mathematical concepts and what appeared to be peaceful greetings, which excited everyone aboard the Horizon, because this was humanity's first contact with alien life, and Jake ordered the crew to prepare a response signal using the same mathematical patterns they had received. When they broadcast their reply into space, Jake felt both excitement and nervousness because he knew this moment would change everything for humanity, and sure enough, within 12 hours, they received a much more complex transmission that Elena was able to partially decode, and she reported that the aliens called themselves the Valdari Empire, and they claimed to represent a peaceful alliance of multiple species who wanted to welcome humanity into the galactic community. Admiral Carter arrived aboard the Horizon 3 weeks later, accompanied by a full diplomatic team led by Ambassador Peter Hayes and dozens of scientists and military advisors who wanted to study every aspect of the alien communications. And Carter explained to Jake that Earth's governments were extremely interested in establishing formal contact with these Valdari, but they also wanted to be very careful about how they proceeded. The Valdari messages became more frequent and detailed over the following weeks, and Elena discovered that their language was actually quite sophisticated, with complex grammar and extensive vocabulary, which suggested a highly advanced civilization, and the aliens claimed they had been watching human development for some time and were impressed by humanity's technological progress, especially their recent achievement of faster than light travel. Elena felt something was wrong about the way the Valdari spoke about humans in their messages because they seemed to know far more about human capabilities and history than they should know if they had only recently made contact. And she brought her concerns to Commander Ryan Torres, who was Earth's top intelligence officer and had come aboard the Horizon to monitor the situation. Ryan began analyzing the Valdari communications from a security perspective and noticed several disturbing patterns in how the aliens described human society and technology, and it became clear that the Valdari had been observing Earth for much longer than they claimed, which raised serious questions about their true intentions and why they had chosen this moment to reveal themselves to humanity. The aliens eventually invited Earth's representatives to attend a formal diplomatic summit on a neutral world called Kepler 442b, where they could meet face-to-face and discuss humanity's role in the galactic community, and Admiral Carter was eager to accept this invitation, but Ryan urged caution because he suspected the Valdari might not be as peaceful as they claimed to be. Elena continued studying the alien language and discovered subtle linguistic patterns that suggested the Valdari viewed humans as primitive beings who needed guidance rather than equals deserving respect. And when she shared this analysis with Ryan, they both became convinced that something was very wrong with the entire situation. But Admiral Carter dismissed their concerns as paranoia. Ambassador Hayes prepared for the diplomatic mission with optimism and excitement about representing humanity in its first interstellar negotiations, and he selected a team of Earth's best diplomats and scientists to accompany him to the summit, while Jake was ordered to transport the diplomatic party to Kepler 442b aboard the Horizon. During the journey to the alien world, Elena and Ryan worked together to analyze every piece of Valdari communication they had received, and they discovered that the aliens consistently used language patterns. That indicated they expected humans to accept a subordinate position in their empire rather than join as equal partners, and this realization filled them both with dread about what might happen at the summit. When they arrived at Kepler 442b, Jake was amazed to see massive alien ships orbiting the planet, and the Valdari technology was clearly far more advanced than anything humans had ever built, and the alien vessels were sleek and powerful-looking, with energy signatures that his sensors could barely comprehend, and Jake began to understand why Ryan had been so worried about human safety. The Valdari representatives who met the human delegation were impressive beings from 3 different species, and they welcomed Ambassador Hayes with elaborate ceremonies and formal speeches about galactic cooperation, but Elena noticed that their translators were too perfect, and their knowledge of human customs too detailed for beings who claimed to have just learned about Earth Ambassador. Hayes was invited to a grand hall where hundreds of alien dignitaries had gathered to witness humanity's introduction to galactic civilization, and the lead Valdari representative began explaining how their empire maintained peace and order throughout the galaxy by providing guidance and oversight to younger species who needed help developing their societies properly. It was then that the truth became clear, as the Valdari speaker calmly explained that humanity had been selected to join their empire as a client species under Valdari supervision, and they presented what they called a generous offer for humans to accept their guidance in exchange for protection and access to advanced technology. Ambassador Hayes felt his blood run cold as he realized that this was not a negotiation between equals, but rather a demand for submission disguised as diplomacy, and when he asked what would happen if humanity rejected their offer, the Valdari representative smiled coldly and explained that species who refused their guidance rarely survived long enough to regret their decision. Ambassador Peter Hayes stood in the alien hall surrounded by hundreds of hostile faces from 3 different species as he delivered humanity's response to the Valdari ultimatum, and his voice remained steady as he told them that humans would never accept slavery disguised as guidance, and that Earth would rather face destruction than surrender its freedom to any empire, no matter how powerful they claim to be. The lead Valdari representative listened to Hayes with what appeared to be amusement, and then gestured to his guards who immediately surrounded the human diplomatic team, and Hayes found himself and his people being escorted to what the aliens politely called guest quarters, but which were clearly prison cells equipped with energy barriers that would prevent any escape attempts. Captain Jake Morrison watched from the horizon as alien soldiers took the human delegation away, and he wanted desperately to intervene, but knew that his single ship would be destroyed instantly by the massive Valdari fleet that surrounded the planet, and instead he followed his orders to return to Earth immediately with news of what had happened at the summit. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks, during which Jake and his crew transmitted constant reports to Admiral Lisa Carter about everything they had witnessed, and Dr. Elena Rodriguez worked frantically to analyze every piece of Valdari technology they had observed, while Commander Ryan Torres began developing plans for how humanity might defend itself against such advanced enemies. When the horizon reached Earth, Jake found the planet in chaos as news of the failed negotiations had already spread and protests filled the streets of major cities while government leaders argued about how to respond to the alien threat, and President Maria Santos had declared a state of emergency and ordered all military forces to prepare for possible invasion. Admiral Carter summoned Jake to an emergency meeting at Space Command headquarters, where he briefed the top military leaders about Valdari capabilities and technology, and the news was not encouraging because the alien ships were larger and more powerful than anything in Earth's fleet, and their energy weapons could probably destroy human vessels before they could even get close enough to fight back. Dr. Elena Rodriguez presented her analysis of Valdari communications to the military council, and explained that the aliens had been studying human society for over a century, while carefully hiding their presence, and they knew everything about human military capabilities and tactics, which gave them an enormous advantage in any conflict that might develop. President Santos addressed the world that evening, explaining the situation and calling for unity in the face of the alien threat. But many world leaders argued that humanity should try to negotiate some kind of compromise with the Valdari, rather than face certain destruction in a hopeless war against Superior. Technology General Alex Turner began mobilizing Earth's military forces, but everyone knew the situation was desperate, because humans had never fought an interstellar war and their weapons were primitive compared to what the aliens possessed, and the Valdari had given humanity exactly 30 days to surrender or face the consequences of continued defiance. Dr. Kevin Mitchell joined Elena's research team, and together they began studying captured recordings of Valdari technology, looking for any possible weaknesses that human forces might exploit, and their work was complicated by the fact that alien technology operated on principles that human science barely understood. Elena discovered that the Valdari Empire consisted of 3 distinct species working together, and each brought different strengths to their alliance, and the Zephyrians were the military leaders who commanded their fleets, while the Nethrix provided advanced technology and the Corvani contributed psychic abilities that helped coordinate their forces. Ryan Torres established a new intelligence division dedicated to studying the alien threat, and his analysts worked around the clock to understand Valdari military doctrine and tactics. But everything they learned made the situation look more hopeless, because the aliens had conquered dozens of other species using the same methods they planned to use against humanity. Jake Morrison was promoted to admiral and given command of Earth's space defense forces, which consisted of barely 200 ships scattered across the solar system, and most of these vessels were designed for exploration or cargo transport rather than military combat. And Jake knew they would need miracles to survive even a single battle against the Valdari fleet. Dr. Mitchell made the first breakthrough when he realized that Valdari technology followed very predictable patterns based on their rigid hierarchical thinking, and while their systems were more advanced than human technology, they lacked the flexibility and adaptability that came naturally to human engineers, and this might provide opportunities for unconventional tactics. Elena studied recordings of Valdari communications and noticed that the 3 species in their empire had very different ways of thinking and solving problems, but they had been forced to work together for so long that they had developed standardized procedures for everything, and this standardization might actually be a weakness that humans could exploit. Admiral Carter approved plans for crash programs to upgrade human weapons and defenses, but everyone knew that 30 days was not nearly enough time to close the technology gap between human and Valdari forces, and the best they could hope for was to make the invasion more costly than the aliens expected. President Santos received messages from several world leaders suggesting that humanity should reconsider the Valdari offer and accept client status rather than face annihilation, but she refused to even discuss surrender, and instead ordered all available resources to be devoted to defense preparations. Jake worked with his staff to develop new tactics that might confuse or surprise the Valdari forces, and they decided that human unpredictability might be their greatest weapon, because the aliens seemed to expect all species to follow logical military doctrines, and humans had a long history of succeeding through chaos and desperation. The countdown to invasion continued as Earth's forces prepared for a war they could not win, and Jake stood on the bridge of his new flagship, looking out at the solar system that humanity had called home for thousands of years, and he wondered if future generations would remember how hard their ancestors had fought for freedom. Elena and Kevin made another important discovery when they realized that Valdari computer systems were all interconnected to improve efficiency and coordination. But this connectivity might also make them vulnerable to the right kind of cyber attack if humans could find a way to infiltrate their networks. As the deadline approached, Jake received reports that several other intelligent species throughout the galaxy were watching to see how humanity would respond to the Valdari ultimatum, and some of these species had apparently been hoping for someone brave enough to challenge the empire that had dominated them for centuries. The final week before invasion saw frantic activity throughout the solar system as human forces moved into defensive positions and civilians were evacuated from areas likely to be targeted by alien attacks. And Jake knew that win or lose humanity would face this threat with courage and determination. On the last day before the deadline expired, Jake broadcast a message to all human forces reminding them that they were fighting not just for Earth, but for the principle that no species should be forced to surrender its freedom to tyrants, and that their resistance might inspire others throughout the galaxy to stand up against oppression. The Valdari invasion fleet arrived exactly 30 days after their ultimatum expired, and War Commander Thex of the Zephyrians led over 300 massive warships into Earth's solar system, expecting to crush human resistance within a few hours and establish complete control over humanity's homeworld before the day was over. Admiral Jake Morrison watched the alien fleet approach from his command ship UNS Defiance and knew that every human vessel in the system was outgunned and outmatched. But he also knew that surrender was not an option, and he opened communications to all human forces with a simple message that they would make the aliens pay dearly for every inch of space they tried to claim. The first battle began near Jupiter's orbital stations, where Captain Nicole Webb commanded a squadron of human destroyers against a Valdari assault group, and her ships were destroyed one by one, but each human vessel managed to damage multiple alien ships before dying, and the Valdari commanders were surprised by how fiercely the humans fought, even when facing certain defeat. War Commander Thex had expected the humans to follow standard military doctrine and try to preserve their forces for a defensive campaign, but instead, Jake ordered his ships to attack the alien fleet directly using tactics that made no logical sense and resulted in massive human casualties, but also inflicted unexpected damage on Valdari vessels. Dr. Elena Rodriguez and Dr. Kevin Mitchell worked frantically in their underground laboratory trying to complete their secret project while the battle raged overhead, and they had discovered a way to create a computer virus that could potentially infiltrate Valdari networks. But they needed more time to finish their work and test their theories. The alien fleet pressed deeper into the solar system, destroying human orbital facilities and space stations, but each victory cost them more ships than they had anticipated because human commanders refused to retreat and instead threw their vessels directly at Valdari formations in desperate ramming attacks that the aliens found impossible to predict, or Counter-General Alex Turner coordinated Earth's surface defenses as Valdari landing forces began, attacking major cities and military installations. But his troops had been trained in guerrilla warfare tactics that proved highly effective against alien soldiers who expected conventional battlefield behavior and instead found themselves fighting an enemy that appeared everywhere and nowhere. Captain Webb led a special forces unit that managed to capture several pieces of Valdari technology during ground battles, and she ordered her engineers to study the alien weapons and equipment, looking for ways to turn their own technology against them. And after several days of intense analysis, they succeeded in reverse engineering basic alien energy weapons. The Valdari forces found themselves fighting a war unlike anything they had ever experienced, because humans refused to follow any predictable patterns and instead used desperate tactics that seemed to border on insanity but somehow managed to inflict serious damage on superior alien forces through sheer determination and creativity. Jake realized that his flagship was taking too much damage to remain effective in the battle. But rather than retreat, he ordered his crew to evacuate while he piloted the Defiance directly into the largest Valdari dreadnought, and the resulting collision destroyed both ships but proved to human forces throughout the system that their admiral was willing to die alongside them. The destruction of both the Defiance and the Valdari dreadnought shocked War Commander Thex, who had never encountered an enemy willing to sacrifice valuable resources in such an apparently wasteful manner. But the human action inspired other ship commanders to attempt similar ramming attacks that began to seriously damage the alien fleet. Elena and Kevin finally completed their computer virus, which they named Prometheus, after the mythological figure who stole fire from the gods and brought it to humanity, and they began testing the program on captured Valdari technology while hoping they could find a way to deploy it against the main alien fleet ambassador Peter Hayes, who had been held prisoner on the alien world, managed to organize a resistance movement among other captured species, and he discovered that many of these aliens had been waiting for someone to lead a rebellion against Valdari rule, and humanity's fierce resistance was inspiring hope throughout the galaxy. The ground war on Earth continued for months, with human forces using hit-and-run tactics that the Valdari found impossible to counter effectively, and General Turner's troops would strike alien positions without warning and then disappear into urban areas or wilderness regions where the aliens could not track them. Captain Webb's Special Forces unit grew larger as more human soldiers learned to use captured Valdari weapons and equipment, and they began conducting increasingly bold raids on alien supply lines and communication centers while gathering intelligence about Valdari military capabilities and weaknesses. War Commander Thex faced growing criticism from the other species in the Valdari alliance because the conquest of Earth was taking much longer than predicted and costing far more resources than anyone had anticipated, and some alien leaders began questioning whether humans might be too dangerous to keep alive even as slaves. The Corvani psychics, who had always been able to read the thoughts and emotions of other species, found that human minds were chaotic and unpredictable in ways that made their abilities almost useless, and this discovery shook their confidence in Valdari's superiority and made them wonder if they had finally encountered a species they could not dominate. Elena succeeded in deploying the Prometheus virus through captured Valdari communication equipment, and within hours, the alien computer networks began experiencing systematic failures that disrupted their coordination and navigation systems, and suddenly, their greatest strength became a critical vulnerability. Jake's successor, Admiral Ryan Torres, took command of the surviving human space forces and began using the confusion caused by the virus to launch coordinated attacks on Valdari positions throughout the solar system, and for the first time since the invasion began, human forces started winning actual battles against their alien enemies. The news of human resistance spread quickly throughout the galaxy, and Ambassador Hayes reported that dozens of subjugated species were beginning to organize their own rebellions against Valdari rule, and many of these aliens were requesting human assistance and tactical advice for their liberation movements. President Maria Santos broadcast a message to the entire galaxy calling on all oppressed species to rise up against their Valdari masters and promising that humanity would provide whatever support they could to any people fighting for their freedom, and this message was intercepted and retransmitted by rebel groups on countless worlds. The war that the Valdari had expected to end in hours had stretched into months with no clear end in sight, and their empire was beginning to face rebellions on multiple fronts while their fleet remained bogged down in a grinding conflict with an enemy that refused to accept defeat no matter how hopeless their situation appeared. 6 months after the invasion began, Colonel Danny Price led a daring raid on a major Valdari supply depot orbiting Mars, and his strike team managed to capture advanced alien weapons and technology that Dr. Kevin Mitchell immediately began reverse engineering into new hybrid weapons that combined human creativity with Valdari power systems. Admiral Ryan Torres found himself commanding a growing fleet of captured and modified alien ships as human forces learned to adapt Valdari technology to their own needs and fighting styles, and these hybrid vessels proved more effective than pure human or alien designs because they combined the best features of both technologies. The Prometheus virus created by Dr. Elena Rodriguez continued to spread through Valdari computer networks, causing increasing chaos in their communications and coordination systems, and the aliens discovered that their interconnected technology, which had always been their greatest strength, was now becoming their greatest weakness. War Commander Thex faced mounting pressure from the Valdari leadership as rebellions erupted on 17 different worlds, and many of these uprisings were receiving tactical support and weapons from human special forces units that had somehow managed to travel between star systems despite the ongoing war. Captain Nicole Webb had been promoted to general and now commanded all human special operations throughout the galaxy, and her teams worked with rebel groups on dozens of worlds, teaching them guerrilla warfare tactics and helping them capture Valdari weapons and equipment for their own use. The psychological impact on the Valdari forces was becoming severe as they realized they were facing an enemy unlike anything in their previous experience, and the three species that made up their empire began questioning each other's leadership and tactics as their supposedly easy conquest turned into a nightmare. Dr. Mitchell completed development of several new weapon systems that used captured Valdari technology in ways the aliens had never intended, and these weapons proved highly effective against Valdari shields and armor because they exploited weaknesses that the original designers had never considered. Admiral Torres launched a major offensive against the Valdari mining operations in the Tau Ceti system, and his combined human and rebel fleet succeeded in liberating thousands of enslaved aliens who immediately joined the growing coalition fighting against the Empire. The freed slaves brought valuable intelligence about Valdari operations throughout the galaxy, and many of them had technical knowledge that helped human engineers understand alien technology better and develop more effective weapons and defenses. Alina discovered that the Corvani psychics were becoming increasingly unreliable because exposure to human minds was damaging their mental abilities, and several Corvani commanders had suffered complete psychological breakdowns after attempting to read the thoughts of human prisoners. President Maria Santos established formal diplomatic relations with rebel groups on 43 different worlds and created the Free Species Alliance as an alternative to Valdari rule. And this new organization was based on principles of equality and cooperation rather than domination, and Control War Commander Thex attempted to end the rebellions by ordering brutal crackdowns on several rebel worlds. But these actions only inspired more species to join the growing resistance movement, and human advisors helped coordinate simultaneous uprisings that stretched Valdari forces beyond their limits. Colonel Price discovered that Valdari military doctrine was extremely rigid and predictable, which allowed human forces to anticipate alien tactics and develop effective countermeasures. And this intelligence was shared with rebel groups throughout the galaxy who used it to win several important victories. The Nethrix, who provided most of the technology for the Valdari Empire, began experiencing serious problems as the Prometheus virus infected their research facilities and manufacturing centers, and production of new weapons and ships slowed dramatically just when they were needed most. General Webb's special forces conducted a series of raids that destroyed key Valdari communication relays and supply bases, which further disrupted their ability to coordinate operations across multiple star systems, and the Empire began to fragment as different regions lost contact with Central Command. Admiral Torres received reports that several Valdari commanders were secretly negotiating with rebel groups and offering to switch sides in exchange for amnesty and protection. And these defections provided valuable intelligence about Valdari military capabilities and strategic plans. The war had spread to over 60 star systems, and the Valdari Empire found itself fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who shared tactical information and coordinated their attacks through networks established by human military advisors and communications specialists. Alina and Kevin developed an upgraded version of the Prometheus virus that could actively take control of Valdari computer systems rather than simply disrupting them. And when this new program was deployed, It began turning Valdari weapons against their own forces. President Santos broadcast another message throughout the galaxy, announcing the formation of a joint military command that would coordinate liberation efforts across all rebel territories, and Admiral Torres was appointed as the first commander of this multi-species alliance. War Commander Thex realized that his empire was facing complete collapse and attempted to negotiate a ceasefire with human forces, but Admiral Torres refused to consider any agreement that did not include complete Valdari withdrawal from all occupied territories and recognition of the independence of all enslaved species. The Zephyrian military commanders began arguing with their Nethrix and Corvani allies as each species blamed the others for their failures against human forces, and this internal conflict weakened Valdari unity just when they needed to present a unified front against the growing rebellion. Dr. Mitchell succeeded in creating portable versions of the Prometheus virus that could be deployed by individual soldiers during combat operations, and these devices allowed human and rebel forces to disable Valdari equipment during battles and turn the aliens' own technology against them. General Webb reported that rebel forces were now operating in every sector of Valdari space, and that many of these groups had achieved complete control over their home systems and were beginning to launch their own attacks on remaining Valdari strongholds. The economic strain of fighting a galaxy-wide war was beginning to affect Valdari society as resources were diverted from civilian needs to military operations, and reports reached the rebels that there was growing unrest even on the Valdari homeworlds as their populations suffered from shortages and increased taxation. Admiral Torres began planning a massive offensive against the Valdari capital system while coordinating with rebel forces throughout the galaxy to launch simultaneous attacks that would prevent the aliens from concentrating their remaining forces for a final defense of their homeworld. 2 years after the war began, Admiral Ryan Torres commanded a massive coalition fleet of liberated species as they approached Nexus Prime, the heavily defended homeworld of the Valdari Empire, and the final battle that would determine the fate of countless worlds and billions of enslaved beings throughout the galaxy. The coalition fleet included ships from 26 different species, all working together under human tactical coordination, and this diversity of technologies and fighting styles created combinations that the rigid Valdari defenders found impossible to predict or counter. Effectively, General Nicole Webb led a special assault force that included volunteers from 6 different species, and their mission was to disable the planetary defense grid that protected Nexus Prime from orbital attack, and each species contributed unique abilities that made the team more effective than any single group could have been. War Commander Thex commanded the final Valdari fleet from his flagship, and he knew that this battle would determine whether his empire survived or fell to the rebellion that humanity had inspired, and he was determined to fight to the death rather than accept defeat Dr. Elena Rodriguez had perfected the Prometheus virus and created a master program that could take complete control of any Valdari computer system, and she prepared to deploy this ultimate weapon during the final battle while Dr. Kevin Mitchell worked to ensure that coalition forces would not be affected by the cyber attack. The battle began when coalition forces engaged the outer defense perimeter around Nexus Prime, and immediately the tactical advantages of diversity became apparent as different species used their unique capabilities to support each other in ways that maximized their combined effectiveness. Admiral Torres coordinated the space battle while maintaining communication with General Webb's ground assault team and with rebel forces throughout the galaxy who were launching simultaneous attacks to prevent any Valdari reinforcements from reaching their homeworld. Colonel Danny Price commanded a squadron of hybrid ships that used modified Valdari technology enhanced with human innovations, and his vessels proved highly effective at penetrating enemy defenses because they combined alien power systems with human tactical creativity. The Valdari Planetary Defense Grid was the most sophisticated military installation in their empire, and it had never been successfully attacked, but General Webb's multi-species assault team approached the problem from angles that the original designers had never considered. Elena deployed the Master Prometheus virus, which immediately began taking control of Valdari computer systems throughout the capital system, and within hours entire sections of their defense network were turning against their own forces. War Commander Thex watched in horror as his ships began firing on each other due to the computer virus, and he realized that humanity had found a way to turn the Valdari Empire's greatest strength into its ultimate weakness. The ground assault on the defense grid succeeded when team members from each species used their natural abilities to overcome obstacles that would have stopped any single group, and the combined effort resulted in the complete shutdown of the planetary defenses. Admiral Torres faced a critical decision when the defense grid fell, because his fleet now had the power to destroy Nexus Prime and end Valdari civilization forever, but he remembered the principles that the Coalition was fighting for and refused to commit genocide even against his enemies. Instead, Torres demanded the complete and unconditional surrender of all Valdari forces and the immediate liberation of all enslaved species throughout their former empire. And he gave War Commander Thex 1 hour to respond before the Coalition would begin selective strikes against military targets. War Commander Thex found himself abandoned by many of his own officers as Valdari ships began surrendering individually and switching sides to join the Coalition forces, and the rigid unity that had held the Empire together for centuries finally collapsed under the pressure of defeat. Dr. Mitchell detected massive energy buildups on several Valdari ships and realized that some alien commanders were preparing to activate doomsday weapons that would destroy both fleets rather than accept defeat, and he immediately warned Admiral Torres about the threat. General Webb received intelligence that War Commander Thex was planning to detonate a planet-killing weapon that would destroy Nexus Prime along with everyone in the system, and she began planning a desperate mission to stop him. The final space battle saw individual Valdari ships switching sides in the middle of combat, as their crews realized that continued resistance was hopeless, and many alien commanders chose to join the Coalition rather than die for an empire that had already fallen. Captain Price volunteered for a suicide mission when sensors detected that War Commander Thex's flagship was preparing to fire its doomsday weapon, and he piloted his ship directly into the alien vessel while his crew evacuated to other ships. The collision between Price's ship and the Valdari flagship prevented the doomsday weapon from firing and eliminated War Commander Thex along with the last organized resistance to Coalition forces. But the cost was the life of one of humanity's greatest heroes. Elena watched the final moments of the battle from the Coalition command ship and realized that humanity had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history by defeating a superior enemy through inspiration and cooperation rather than pure military force. The surrender of the remaining Valdari forces marked the end of an empire that had dominated the galaxy for over 1,000 years and the beginning of a new era based on freedom and cooperation between all intelligent species. Admiral Torres accepted the formal surrender of the Valdari Empire and immediately began implementing plans to establish democratic governments on all liberated worlds, while ensuring that former enemies would be treated fairly and given opportunities to join the new galactic community. President Maria Santos arrived at Nexus Prime aboard a diplomatic vessel to oversee the transition from Empire to Alliance, and she brought with her representatives from dozens of species who would help create a new form of galactic government based on equality and mutual respect. The victory celebration was muted by the memory of all those who had died during the long war, but there was also hope for the future, as former enemies began working together to build something better than what had existed before. Dr. Mitchell began developing new technologies that combined the best innovations from all member species, of the coalition, and these advances promised to benefit everyone, rather than just the dominant military power. General Webb was tasked with establishing a new multi-species military force that would protect the freedom of all worlds and prevent any future attempts to recreate the kind of oppressive empire that had just been defeated. The transformation of the galaxy had begun, and humanity's role was not as conquerors, but as teachers and inspirers who had shown that even the most powerful tyranny could be defeated by those who refused to surrender their freedom and dignity. 10 years after the fall of the Valdari Empire, President Maria Santos stood before the Galactic Council on the former imperial capital of Nexus Prime and watched representatives from over 200 species work together to solve problems through cooperation rather than conquest. And she knew that humanity had achieved something far greater than military victory. Admiral Ryan Torres commanded the Free Species Defense Fleet, which included vessels from dozens of worlds, and this multi-species force protected trade routes and responded to emergencies throughout the galaxy while ensuring that no single species could ever again dominate others through military force. Dr. Elena Rodriguez led the Galactic Science Exchange, where researchers from all member species shared knowledge freely and worked together on projects that benefited everyone, and the technological advances achieved through this cooperation far exceeded anything that had been accomplished under the old imperial system. The former Valdari territories had been reorganized into independent systems with democratic governments, and many of the former imperial citizens had chosen to join the Free Species Alliance after learning the benefits of freedom and self-determination. General Nicole Webb trained a new generation of multi-species peacekeepers who specialized in protecting civilian populations and preventing conflicts through diplomacy rather than force. And these teams had successfully resolved dozens of potential wars. Without firing a single shot, Dr. Kevin Mitchell continued developing new technologies that combined innovations from all Alliance members, and his research facilities on dozens of worlds worked on everything from medical advances to space exploration. And the sharing of knowledge had accelerated progress for everyone. The memorial on Earth honored all those who had died during the Liberation War, including enemy soldiers who had fought bravely for their beliefs, and the inscription read that here lay proof that no species, no matter how powerful, could break the spirit of those who refused to surrender their freedom. Ambassador Peter Hayes, who had survived his imprisonment and helped organize the initial rebellions, now served as the first Director of Interspecies Relations, and his office worked to prevent misunderstandings between different cultures and to promote peaceful cooperation throughout the galaxy. Captain Danny Price was remembered as a hero throughout the Alliance, and ships from dozens of worlds carried his name, while the sacrifice he had made during the final battle inspired countless others to put the common good ahead of personal safety. The phrase "Unbroken Defiance" had become a rallying cry for oppressed peoples throughout the galaxy, and whenever dictators or would-be conquerors threatened freedom, the Free Species Defense Fleet stood ready to answer the call for help. Elena often reflected on how humanity's greatest victory had not been military, but philosophical, because they had proven that diversity and freedom created strength that no tyranny could match. And this lesson had transformed galactic civilization. President Santos established the Freedom Institute, where young beings from all species learned about democracy and individual rights, and graduates from this institution returned to their home worlds to teach others about the principles that had defeated the Valdari Empire. The economic prosperity that followed the liberation exceeded anything achieved under imperial rule, because free trade and voluntary cooperation proved far more effective than forced tribute and slave labor, and living standards improved dramatically throughout the former empire. War Commander Thex had become a cautionary tale told throughout the galaxy about the dangers of believing that military power alone could guarantee lasting dominance, and his empire's fall proved that even the mightiest tyranny would eventually face those who refused. To be broken, Admiral Torres received reports from exploration fleets that were discovering new worlds and making contact with previously unknown species, and in every case, the The Free Species Alliance welcomed these newcomers as equals rather than potential subjects. Dr. Mitchell's research teams had developed technologies that allowed real-time communication across the entire galaxy, and this advancement helped different species maintain close cooperation despite the vast distances between their homeworlds. The transformation of galactic society continued as former slaves became leaders and former enemies worked together on projects that would have been impossible under the old system of imperial domination and exploitation general. Webb established training centers on hundreds of worlds where beings from different species learned to work together effectively, and these programs created bonds of friendship and understanding that strengthened the entire alliance. Alina's linguistic research had evolved into a comprehensive study of how different species could communicate more effectively, and her work helped prevent misunderstandings that might otherwise have led to conflicts between alliance members. The children who grew up in the post-liberation galaxy learned about cooperation and mutual respect as natural parts of life, and they would become the first generation to see diversity as a source of strength rather than a cause for conflict. President Santos knew that humanity's role in galactic affairs would always be special because they had been the first species to successfully resist Valdari domination and inspire others to fight for their freedom. But she also knew that true leadership meant helping others achieve their full potential. The final scene took place on a massive space station where beings from dozens of species worked together on projects that would benefit the entire galaxy, and human engineers collaborated with alien scientists to build technologies that neither group could have created alone. A young human child asked her grandmother Elena why their species was called the Unbroken Defiance, and Elena explained that humans had earned that name by refusing to surrender their freedom, even when facing impossible odds, and by inspiring others to fight for their own liberty. The galaxy learned that day what it truly meant to be human, which was to face overwhelming challenges with courage and determination while never forgetting that true strength came from helping others achieve their dreams rather than imposing your will upon them. The stars themselves seemed brighter now that freedom had replaced tyranny, and every world in the Alliance knew that as long as the human spirit of unbroken defiance survived, no dictator or empire would ever again be able to crush the hopes and dreams of those who believed in liberty. Admiral Torres stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking out at a galaxy where former enemies now worked together as friends, and he knew that humanity had given the universe something precious that could never be taken away, which was proof that freedom was worth any sacrifice and that hope could overcome even the darkest tyranny.